Static crackles harshly through millions of radios across the Soviet Union, as anxious families crowd around awaiting Joseph Stalin's voice to emerge from the silence on May 9, 1945. Cities lay shattered beyond recognition, once majestic streets in Moscow and Leningrad, now reduced to scorched ruins, scarred by bombs and artillery shells that relentlessly pounded them day after day, year after year. Citizens sit exhausted, haunted by memories of air raid sirens, echoing through long nights, sleeplessly waiting in shelters, clutching their loved ones, praying for survival as buildings crumbled above them into clouds of choking dust. Today, everyone across the vast nation knows the broadcast they await could forever change their lives, a speech that promises an end, yet signals the start of something even more uncertain and potentially dangerous. The voice finally emerges, powerful, steady, and clear. Stalin declares unconditional victory over Nazi Germany, announcing to millions that the bloodiest, most devastating conflict in human history is finally over. His words send shivers through those listening as he recounts the horrors of the war, describing vividly the catastrophic invasion by Hitler's forces known as Operation Barbarossa, an assault so ruthless it left entire villages wiped from existence in mere hours. Stalin reminds listeners of the fierce resistance Soviet forces put forth, highlighting specifically the desperate defense of Stalingrad, where nearly 1 million Soviet lives perished, holding the line inch by bloody inch, refusing to yield even as supplies dwindled and hope faded. Families across the nation listen in stunned silence, remembering loved ones, lost brothers, fathers' sons who fought bravely, never returning from battles, whose names became synonymous with suffering and heroism, battles such as Kursk, Kharkov, and Berlin. The siege of Leningrad remains particularly painful in the collective memory. Stalin describes how the citizens of that great city endured nearly 900 days, trapped by German forces, starving, surviving on meager rations made from sawdust and glue, refusing to surrender, despite unimaginable suffering. Listeners can still feel the desperation in Stalin's voice as he praises the resilience of the Soviet people. Those ordinary citizens who showed extraordinary courage under relentless assault, their stories now immortalized in history, yet forever etched with sorrow. Women from across the nation took jobs in factories like Uralvagonzavod and Magnitogorsk, working tirelessly under harsh conditions, building tanks, artillery shells, and ammunition essential to sustaining the front lines and ensuring victory was achievable. Farmers, too, played a pivotal role, harvesting crops under threat of bombardment in regions like Ukraine and the Volga, providing food supplies crucial to keeping troops fed and morale high, even as their own homes burned around them. Stalin carefully acknowledges these immense sacrifices, highlighting that victory belongs to every citizen who endured the hardships of war, stating unequivocally that their courage, their labor, and their blood forged the path to triumph. Yet even as victory is declared, Stalin's tone carries an unmistakable warning, reminding listeners that peace is fragile, easily shattered by complacency or internal division. He insists vigilance must be absolute, for threats still loom both abroad and at home. Suspicion creeps into his words, as Stalin cautions against trusting former wartime allies, subtly referencing growing tensions with nations such as the United States and Britain, whose post-war ambitions now conflict directly with Soviet interests. Families gathered around radios sense immediately the subtle implications of Stalin's words, understanding that victory has not brought security. Rather, it has unleashed new, unpredictable geopolitical tensions that threaten to engulf their lives once again. In cities like Kiev and Minsk, where devastation was severe, citizens now face immense struggles. Millions left homeless, orphaned children, wandering streets once bustling with life, their futures uncertain, dependent entirely upon Stalin's promise to rebuild rapidly and effectively. Listeners feel urgency intensify as Stalin lays out ambitious plans to reconstruct the country, promising state-led projects aimed at modernizing infrastructure, industry, and agriculture, ensuring that sacrifices were not made in vain. Yet beneath these bold assurances, a deeper unease lingers as Stalin emphasizes that internal vigilance remains paramount, hinting ominously at ongoing domestic threats, espionage, and sabotage within their own communities. Citizens sense an underlying warning that their neighbors, even friends or family members, might secretly undermine national security. Everyone now feels watched, closely monitored, under suspicion of disloyalty or treachery. Factories once focused exclusively on producing weapons now shift production overnight, emphasizing civilian needs like agricultural equipment and vehicles, a move designed to stabilize society, yet reminding workers how quickly their lives remain subject to state demands and priorities. Communities across the Soviet Union now brace for strict new security measures, tighter surveillance, and increased state presence. Stalin makes clear the peace won today demands constant protection through discipline, loyalty, and unwavering commitment to socialist principles. Schools and cultural institutions immediately adjust their curricula and messaging to align with Stalin's directives, promoting a strict ideological adherence and painting the recent victory as proof of socialist superiority over fascism and capitalism alike. Stalin openly calls for nationwide unity, declaring emphatically that the Soviet Union must remain tightly bound together through shared sacrifice and collective vigilance, asserting unequivocally that individual freedom must be secondary to national security at this critical juncture. The broadcast leaves listeners increasingly aware that victory, while celebrated, also places enormous responsibility on every Soviet citizen. Families begin realizing their personal lives will remain deeply intertwined with the overarching ambitions and policies of Stalin's government. Across border regions, soldiers tighten patrols, installing watchtowers and barbed wire overnight, transforming frontiers into heavily fortified zones. Families nearby understand immediately the practical reality of Stalin's warnings about foreign espionage and sabotage. Citizens in occupied territories such as Poland, Hungary, and East Germany witness Soviet troops rapidly establishing new communist regimes installed explicitly to solidify Moscow's dominance, confirming Western fears and fueling global anxieties. Churchill's voice soon counters Stalin's message in Britain, declaring that an iron curtain now descends across Europe, dividing East from West, signaling the emerging Cold War, which Stalin had indirectly referenced in his own speech. As the broadcast finally fades into silence, Soviet families sit quietly processing Stalin's complex message, understanding deeply that while today marks the end of one devastating conflict, the future now holds even greater uncertainties and potential dangers. In homes, factories, and farms across the Soviet Union, people absorb the reality of their leaders' warnings, recognizing clearly that the struggle for security and stability has barely begun. Victory has brought them temporary relief, yet thrust them immediately into another even more precarious battle. As night descends across the battered nation, radios remain quiet. Families begin cautiously discussing among themselves the implications of Stalin's address, acknowledging that their lives must remain closely aligned to state objectives and prepared for whatever new hardships may emerge. Communities brace for the immediate post-war reality promised by Stalin, aware Reconstruction will demand sacrifices, similar to wartime conditions, shortages, rationing, long working hours, and relentless pressures to deliver rapid results without complaint. Citizens in industrial cities, steel plants, and collective farms awaken to new strict quotas and production schedules, reinforcing Stalin's urgency that rebuilding quickly is vital not merely to economic recovery, but to national survival itself. Soviet citizens prepare themselves psychologically, understanding clearly from Stalin's words today that their duty is not over. Victory requires vigilance, sacrifice, discipline, and absolute loyalty to ensure peace does not slip away as quickly as it arrived. In remote corners of the vast nation, citizens listen carefully to news updates over coming weeks and months, always wary that the next broadcast might carry even graver warnings or demands, confirming that despite victory, they remain soldiers in a broader struggle far from finished. As dawn breaks across the Soviet Union, the first rays of sunlight illuminating shattered buildings and scorched fields, families step into streets fully aware that Stalin's powerful broadcast has not simply announced victory, but rather introduced an entirely new era filled with immense challenges, grave responsibilities, and deeply uncertain consequences. In the immediate aftermath of Stalin's powerful victory broadcast, Soviet citizens witness an unprecedented transformation unfolding across their war-torn nation. Sweeping policy changes ordered directly from Moscow reshape every aspect of their daily lives with urgent immediacy. Factories previously committed solely to wartime production immediately pivot to civilian purposes. Industrial giants like Gaz rapidly shift from assembling military vehicles to manufacturing tractors, buses, and trucks desperately needed for reconstruction and agriculture. At the Uralvagonzavod plant workers, who once tirelessly assembled T-34 tanks around the clock, now redirect their efforts toward building railway cars, bulldozers, and industrial equipment vital for rebuilding destroyed infrastructure across the Soviet Union. Magnitogorsk, the colossal steel heart of wartime industry, accelerates its production, further driven by Stalin's demand for rapid economic recovery. Its furnaces blaze day and night, supplying endless steel beams, rails, and construction materials to rebuild entire cities from rubble. Citizens in cities such as Kiev, Kharkov, and Minsk see immediate signs of Stalin's ambitious reconstruction. Promises architects and planners pour in overnight, laying out blueprints for modern hospitals, schools, apartment complexes to replace ruins left by relentless bombing raids. Yet even as new buildings rise swiftly, suspicion deepens among communities. Stalin's stark warnings about espionage and sabotage resonate heavily. Neighbors, colleagues, even friends find themselves subject to suspicion of disloyalty, often disappearing suddenly into the shadows of the night. Lavrentiy Beria, head of Soviet secret police, intensifies domestic security operations, sweeping arrests, target individuals suspected of collaborating with Nazis, spreading capitalist propaganda, or undermining socialist ideals. Thousands vanish, their families left with no explanation, no recourse, only silence and fear. Radio broadcasts, newspapers, and loudspeakers throughout cities constantly echo Stalin's call for vigilance and loyalty, reinforcing a climate of collective responsibility, yet also fostering an environment where personal trust erodes, replaced by state-sanctioned suspicion. Citizens feel immediate changes in their everyday interactions, understanding that casual conversations could now have serious consequences. Every word carefully measured, every gesture closely scrutinized for potential ideological deviation or disloyalty. Stalin's commitment to ideological purity extends aggressively into schools, universities, and cultural institutions. Teachers receive strict guidelines to emphasize Soviet patriotism and socialist principles, openly discouraging Western influences, capitalist values, and independent thinking. Textbooks, curricula, and public messaging uniformly reflect Stalin's vision of the recent victory, portraying it as proof of socialist superiority, highlighting heroic Soviet sacrifices, and casting Western nations increasingly as adversaries attempting to sabotage the nation's recovery. In occupied territories such as East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, Soviet forces quickly established new communist regimes loyal exclusively to Moscow, effectively turning liberation into long-term domination. Populations quickly realize that the price of their newfound freedom is strict Soviet control over every aspect of political, economic, and social life. Churchill's public warnings of an Iron Curtain descending across Europe become vividly clear as fortified borders begin rising between Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe and democratic Western nations. Soviet soldiers aggressively patrol newly established borders, constructing barbed wire fences, watchtowers, and checkpoints to prevent movement toward Western-controlled regions. Citizens within these border zones soon experience harsh new realities. Armed patrols monitor their every move. Movement restrictions, curfews, and frequent security checks become standard, ensuring total Soviet control and severely restricting personal freedoms in the name of collective security. Stalin perceives the West's growing hostility and the introduction of economic aid programs like America's Marshall Plan as explicit threats to Soviet sovereignty and influence across Europe. He quickly labels these aid programs as capitalist weapons, intended solely to undermine socialist unity and enslave liberated nations economically. In response to perceived Western aggression, Stalin intensifies Soviet efforts to match American military and technological advancements. Secret research facilities, such as the closed city of Sarov, rapidly accelerate their atomic research, intent on developing a Soviet atomic bomb to rival American capabilities as quickly as possible. Scientists, engineers, and researchers across the Soviet Union suddenly find themselves operating under immense pressure, knowing that failure could result in severe punishment, yet success might guarantee the nation's survival in an emerging Cold War against Western powers. Citizens everywhere across the Soviet Union experience severe rationing, shortages of consumer goods, and continued hardships. Despite the war's end, families struggle daily to secure adequate food, clothing, and essentials, reinforcing Stalin's message that victory does not necessarily mean comfort or prosperity. Rather, it demands continued sacrifice for national security. Agricultural workers across Ukraine and Belarus labor exhaustively, facing strict quotas and state-controlled distribution systems. Collective farms intensify their production targets ordered by Moscow to deliver sufficient harvests necessary for feeding rapidly expanding urban centers, essential to Stalin's vision of swift industrial recovery. Workers across heavy industrial centers such as Chelyabinsk and Sverdlovsk endure strict production quotas, and state monitoring their lives become tightly regulated by government overseers, demanding absolute commitment, productivity, and unwavering loyalty in the name of economic recovery and socialist ideals. Citizens hear repeated announcements reminding them of their duty to contribute fully toward the national effort, emphasizing discipline, loyalty, and ideological purity. Any perceived slackness or deviation is swiftly punished, reinforcing Stalin's warnings that complacency threatens their newly won peace. As Soviet control tightens domestically, Western powers, particularly Britain and America, grow increasingly alarmed by Stalin's aggressive consolidation of Eastern Europe, openly expressing concerns over Soviet intentions and potential expansionist ambitions. Churchill repeatedly calls for Western unity to contain Soviet influence, fueling global anxieties further. Citizens living along newly established borders quickly feel the growing tension, witnessing firsthand the military buildup on both sides. The once allied Soviet Union and Western powers now stand uneasily facing each other, armed and increasingly hostile, signaling the onset of the Cold War. The United States announces the Truman Doctrine, explicitly aimed at containing Soviet influence globally, marking the official start of ideological and political competition. Citizens worldwide become fully aware that post-war peace is rapidly shifting into a dangerous and uncertain new reality. Within the Soviet Union, citizens remain highly conscious of Stalin's ominous warnings about foreign aggression and domestic espionage. The state-controlled media continually emphasizes threats posed by Western capitalism and ideological subversion, ensuring every Soviet citizen remains alert, vigilant, and ready to sacrifice personal freedoms for national survival. Citizens across every city, town, and village grow accustomed to increased state presence, daily lives monitored through intensive surveillance and strict governmental oversight. Personal privacy becomes nearly non-existent, sacrificed willingly or unwillingly at Stalin's insistence that unity and ideological purity supersede individual rights. The Red Army continues its significant presence throughout Eastern European nations. Citizens in these occupied territories realize quickly that their liberation from Nazi oppression comes at the heavy cost of Soviet domination, forced integration into Moscow's political orbit, denying them genuine independence or self-governance. Every Soviet citizen, from factory workers and farmers to teachers and scientists, experiences the unrelenting demands of Stalin's post-war Reconstruction strategy, understanding fully that their personal ambitions, desires, and comforts remain secondary to collective national objectives directed explicitly from the Kremlin. Soviet families begin quietly adjusting their lives to this harsh new reality, fully aware that Stalin's powerful broadcast marked not merely the end of war, but the beginning of an enduring era characterized by intense geopolitical competition, personal sacrifice, and absolute state control over their destinies. As the weeks and months pass, Stalin continues issuing directives aimed at consolidating Soviet power internally and internationally. Citizens now clearly comprehend their role as soldiers in an ideological struggle against Western capitalism, recognizing vividly that victory requires continued vigilance, unwavering discipline, and permanent readiness for new potential conflicts. Families across the vast Soviet Union sit quietly each evening, anxiously tuning into state-controlled broadcasts, expecting at any moment to hear Stalin's next announcement directive or warning, fully conscious that their lives remain entirely subject to the ambitions, policies, and decisions emanating directly from Moscow. Citizens watch cautiously as the world rapidly divides along ideological lines, aware that Stalin's vision for their future demands unending sacrifices, constant vigilance, and absolute commitment to socialist ideals. They understand completely that victory has thrust them directly into another even more dangerous and uncertain struggle. As Stalin's words echo continuously through state-controlled media, Soviet citizens brace themselves, fully aware their lives will never return to pre-war normalcy, instead accepting stoically the stark reality that peace, prosperity, and individual freedom remain indefinitely subordinate to national security and collective survival under Stalin's unwavering command.